to the IONS podcast. I'm Cam Dales, president and co-founder of Peak Energy. And with me today, I have two very special guests, Ben Steinberg, who's the executive vice president and chair of the critical infrastructure practice at Venn Strategies, and Carly Good, his colleague there, who is an assistant vice president at Venn. And I'm super excited to have this conversation because it's extremely timely in our industry. Both batteries and the energy storage space, much to our chagrin as engineers and scientists, are heavily dependent on what the rules of the road are. What is the policy environment and for deploying energy? I think that's an unavoidable part of the energy space for well over 100 years that's been true. So extremely excited to have Ben and Carly on the pod. Ben, maybe start with you. Could you just introduce yourself? And then we'll turn it over to you, Carly, and would love to hear a little bit about who Venn Strategies is as well.
Thanks so much, Cam. It's always a pleasure to hang out with friends.
Yes.
Both you, Cam, and the whole Peak team. It's really quite a pleasure to be here. So I'm Ben Steinberg. I chair our infrastructure practice at Venn. I joined the firm 7 years ago. Before that, I was at Department of Energy, and I did a stint at the White House, spanning from the Obama administration into the first Trump administration. And in our infrastructure practice, we work a ton on energy, on transportation, and on batteries and critical minerals, and really supply chain issues and manufacturing here at home and with partners abroad. So pleasure to be with all of you, and this is what we live and breathe every day in Washington. So
fantastic. Carly, it'd be great to get your introduction as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cam. So my name's Carly Good. I am an assistant vice president here at Venn, working alongside Venn on all things batteries, critical minerals, energy broadly. I've been here at Venn for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I was in the think tank space, but I've been doing energy policy for the past few years. So, and that's really changed a lot, and batteries have become a larger part of that discussion. So really just excited to be working in this exciting space, and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, great guys. Thank you so much, Ben and Carly. And so we'll start this off the right way. Given that most of our audience are battery nerds, and not all of us, including me, even have ever had the opportunity to peek behind the curtains of what's happening in government. So let's start with the basics. Venn Strategies, I assume, is a lobbying firm, among other things, consulting on all sorts of things government related. What the heck is a lobbying firm anyway, and what does a lobbying firm do? And we in the general culture probably have a slightly negative viewpoint of, quote, lobbyists and the swamp and all the things that politicians love to say about that part of our democracy. But I would love to hear your perspective on it. What does Venn do? What do you guys do day to day? And why is this a good thing or not a good thing for a democracy like the U.S.?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't feel like I'm doing something now that I wasn't doing in government as a federal servant. I'm just doing the corporate side of it. And Venn has a very specific way that we do things here. We're a 60+ person firm. We have a healthcare practice. We have a tax, trade, and finance practice, and our critical infrastructure practice. We even have an oversight investigations practice. We won't get into that. That's really some underbelly stuff in government. But one of our key strengths is coalition building, and we really approach our work in a team environment and building advocates across issues that can help certain corporations and groups of corporations or nonprofits, right, or whomever in society work with government, both in the executive and the legislative branches. I use a terrible baseball analogy in how, we think about this, but you're not, let's say your client is the batter, and you're working with them to get on base and to play the field. Like, our work is to actually put the players on the field and understand what the left fielder's doing and the right fielder and the shortstop, and connect all the dots for that batter so that they can, move on the bases. And that's really what it's about. I mean, in the battery space, you have 10 agencies or more that are working on these issues, and they all interact with one another. And then you have both chambers of Congress with different committees that are working on these issues as well. And so it's our job to be able to know the timing of when to act and how to talk to the government officials, and then ultimately go and achieve what our clients are trying to do with government. It's a big network, and it goes, even spans beyond the government, where you have trade associations and think tanks and universities and national labs and other businesses who are also interacting with government. And so how do you steer that dialogue to achieve something, right? And government is so inextricably linked in our life. So at some point, if you're doing business in this country, you're going to link to the government in some way, and that's really what our job is.
Sure. And I should say I love a good baseball analogy at any time, so we can definitely go back to that. From my perspective, having had some exposure to the process of how laws get made and rules get made in the U.S., hearkening back to Schoolhouse Rock, it's not that different in the real world. But I was struck that, our system is set up as essentially a battle of ideas around what policy should look like, how that should interact with the industry, companies, individuals. In our case, it's the latter on the commerce side. But really, it's the game is played by connecting companies that have a certain point of view around what's the right thing for the country, and sometimes it's aligns. Hopefully, all the time it aligns with what those companies want to do commercially. And it's a matter of finding the right people in the government, whether it's in the Congress or the administration, educating them around the issues, helping them understand the unintended consequences of laws and rules that might actually be counter to the overall goals, and then enabling them to go carry those ideas forward into the debates and arguments and battles that ultimately become legislation. So I think I went into it quite naive of how this whole thing works, maybe 5-10 years ago when I started touching some of these policy points, but have come to an appreciation of it's another form of democracy in the sense that these are the resources that are used to ultimately produce legislation. And, in the end, it's our representatives who've been elected who carry those things forward. Ben, would love to hear a little bit about your background, how you ended up in, this space, particularly as it's moved towards energy and now batteries. I'm sure it wasn't your life's ambition to be a battery policy expert. How did you get into the space? Tell us a little bit about your story.
It's a little bit by background and a little by accident. Interestingly, when I was in government, I was the liaison at DOE with the Defense Department, and so that was my first introduction to batteries, because we were working on joint partnerships with the Defense Department from DOE to build microgrids on DoD bases. So there was that nexus of those two entities working together in government. And I also worked some in the Office of Electricity, where we were pioneering different technologies, battery technologies on the grid. And this was back in the Recovery Act days, so A123 and other companies. So I started to gain exposure of, both, how defense is going to use batteries. We also were working with them on, soldier power, wearable batteries and lightweighting the batteries, and then also on the bulk system on the grid and how batteries were playing into, being spinning reserves and smoothing out the current on the grid. So really, that was sort of my introduction to the sector. Fast forward to Venn, and we had the opportunity to work with a graphite company who's still a client of ours, and they actually do graphite for specialty markets like nuclear and defense and semiconductor chips, but they saw the market really expanding into batteries, and that was driving of the economics of graphite, and it still does. And we looked around, and we and I had said we'd do coalitions here at Venn, and really no one was doing coalitions in the materials space for batteries, right? You have NatBat, but they don't do lobbying. They don't engage as much with elected officials or federal officials. So we did a lot of work to talk to industry and say, what is the need here? And when President Biden got elected, we saw the push for infrastructure funding. So we pulled together what is the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition to work with companies to build the North American market, mostly focused on U.S. development, but also Canadian industry, which is very vibrant as well. And we have these member companies in our coalition across, most of the states in the U.S. and several Canadian provinces still working today, and that's what led us into this world.
That's interesting history. I'd love to focus the discussion around the current topics that are front of mind for many of the companies in the space. Of course, the OBBB, so how many B's that is, we call it the OB cubed around here, having a major impact on strategy and how development companies are developing projects in the renewables and storage space, but also on suppliers like my company, Peak. So I want to ask you about the impacts and what has happened over the last couple of months or month even. But I know that you've been involved in the policy side around energy for quite some time. And I'm guessing, actually, it's not a guess since we had a prep call on this. Full disclosure, we actually do a little bit of homework here rather than a bunch of friends around drinking a beer. But I wanted to ask you, how did we get here? And, at least from my personal experience, the early days of like the BIL and the IRA have led to, some pretty substantial policy levers that we've been operating under. And now there's some changes within the IRA due to the recent bills, and probably goes back even before that with ITC credits and long before I was involved in the renewable space. Can you take us through the history of that? And,
yeah.
I know you were deeply involved in that, both on the government side and then later, as a consultant. So I think it would be great to set the stage for where we are today, thinking about the broader history of energy policy in the United States. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll relate it to batteries and the battery supply chain. I think I could talk to you guys for hours on energy policy broadly. But I think the narrative does start in, we had the Recovery Act in the Obama administration, and there was the initial deployment for battery manufacturing, but it was only at $1 billion, which sounded so amazing and so large at the time. And And the overall investment for DOE at the time was $30 billion, which was double their budget or their appropriation. So the department grew, and then you
and there were what, 3 projects that ultimately came to fruition back in those days. The shovel ready, manufacturing sites. I think there was one in Michigan and a couple in the Midwest.
Yeah, you had A123, you had Johnson Controls. There was even a materials project, which was the predecessor to Albemarle, taking them over. So you had just a few things percolating. There was a lot of grid storage deployment. I think they got on grid storage. There was $1 billion also for deployment of grants. So there were things percolating. Then you go into the Trump administration.
I mean, in your opinion, just to touch on that a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounded like a lot of money at the time, and I remember thinking this was a lot of money back then too. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what has been spent worldwide, particularly in China, to go develop the battery industry writ large. It's small compared to what subsequently happened. What do you think was the outcome of those initial investments? I mean, if you look at the actual facilities, the manufacturing sites, I would say that they haven't made a big impact. But maybe there's a crawl, walk, run sort of approach, and that's led into other things which then have become more important. How do you view that?
I mean, I'm a glass half full person. So what I would say is we got lessons learned out of it. We trained staff in the battery world. A lot of the projects and companies did not pan out, and they fizzled, but the equipment, a lot of it stayed in the US and then was sourced into other companies. And it really was the precursor to what we have now. I think, you could look at it as a giant failure as well, because the projects didn't pan out and that was right around the time when China took off. And some of our talent actually went to China to develop the industry there because the US did not keep the commitment to build the industry here. So there are some positives and certainly some lessons learned and some bad outcomes from that. But it definitely helped us, I would think, from the infrastructure funding and the tax credits in this space. It helped us move faster second time around, and we had learned things from that first go around that we didn't want to repeat this time. I
agree with you on that. I mean, I think specifically phrase the question as, is this a failure? Because I think that can be part of the narrative that you hear in the general culture. But I'm a big believer in the ecosystem required to go create an overall industry. And we've talked on the pod with other guests about different generations of companies also that are required really to get to a certain scale and a certain impact in the world. And, first generation companies, you're starting from scratch. You have nothing. You do not have the suppliers that set up to supply what you're trying to do. And you also don't have the equipment companies. You don't have people who have been trained. You don't have customers who know how to buy your product, even, and the market may not be there. So very difficult in the first generation. Everything you have to do yourself. But then there's another generation of companies that come in, and my experience in the battery space probably starts there at Enovix, which I would think is solidly in the second generation of companies where we were able to benefit from some of those initial investments that were made through those original programs. We were able to benefit from the ecosystem that was being set up by companies like A123 and like Tesla, and the start of an ecosystem of suppliers and materials, supply chain, et cetera. And then, our hope is this time around with companies like Peak, starting it in this day and age in the US, you're really in a sort of a third generation where instead of writing every piece of software from scratch, you can just cut a PO and you've got 10 years of development behind you to just get going and start working on the things that are important in terms of deployment. So I'm a big believer in that. And we here at Peak and, in my previous companies have been on the company side, sort of watching what's happening and benefiting from these investments that have been made through, the policy side that I interrupted you, but you can kind of keep going here of how this is developing, and it's sort of hand in hand.
Yeah, the purpose of the Recovery Act from 2009 was to deploy, and that's it. It was what's evolved since then is a series of industrial policies, and really what we are in now is in an era of industrial policy, which started during the first Trump term, continued in the Biden administration, and has followed on in the second Trump term. And that was driven by the tariffs the Trump administration put in place in the first term, the 301 tariffs on China, and then and was also added, what he added was work on the defense industrial base, which included things like critical and emerging technologies, which includes batteries, as well as the supply chain that supports the defense industrial base. And that really started the underpinning for a reframing and of how we do policy in the United States. And doing industrial policy is hard, and it requires us to fail and then keep going. Mm-hmm. And it also requires us to pick losers and winners. And part of picking winners and losers from the government side is you're ultimately going to pick some losers. And it's, how does the country deal with that? Mm-hmm. What kind of national grit do we have to keep going, because we understand that this is important for our economic well-being as people or our national security. And that's really what we've grappled with. And both the Biden administration and the second Trump term, the Trump team think about these things totally differently. And so that's been really interesting. Like, how do you reframe? Because ultimately, I think there is support for this industry in any setting and in a bipartisan way or nonpartisan way, but it's how you talk about it and the types of incentives or work you're doing between private and public.
It's an interesting point, and I have to say, one of the things that was a shock to me, having spent a fair amount of time now in DC talking to both the administration and to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, I expected to have to make the case for why batteries are important. And instead, not a single lawmaker, Democrat or Republican, ever challenged us on the idea that batteries are incredibly important for our economy and for our national security. That was a surprise.
And you're welcome.
Yeah, right. Well, do you think that it's, so then the difference is, between kind of the Democrat and the Republican approach, does it really just come down to tactics to achieve the same goal, or are there different goals?
Thanks. There are different priorities. So in this administration, there is a gravitation to supporting the warfighter. And what does the warfighter need? Well, the warfighter has evolved over time to need batteries. We are electrifying the force. It's becoming more autonomous. The economy needs energy, and batteries are one of the best ways that you can store energy, no matter what it is, on the grids. And we are going through an AI and data center revolution in this country right now that is going to require dispatchable power and baseload power, and batteries serve both of those needs. So, that's the gravitational pull there. They also frame things in terms of mining and critical minerals, which underpin literally everything that we use in society going to the technology. So if we can really focus on getting the minerals out of the ground and making use of them and deploying them into the economy, that's going to be the lifeblood of how we evolve as an economy, which we relate to. If you go back to the Biden administration, it was, how do we deploy this clean technology so we can have also energy to use, which we desperately need, but also we're solving issues around climate, and that is also a security risk. So they really just came at it differently, but where you meet in the middle is batteries. Because it is such a building block of pretty much it's everywhere. It's in your phone, your computer. It's on the telephone pole. It's in a substation. It's in a warehouse. It's it's everywhere.
Yeah. All roads in energy lead to batteries, in our opinion. Carly, let me bring you into the conversation here as we move, the conversation and the narrative towards the IRA originally, and then the changes that have happened with the new administration. You're an expert in battery energy policy. Can you just briefly, because I want to make sure we have enough time to get into what's happening today, but could you briefly give us an overview of what was in the IRA for batteries, and then help us to understand what has changed over the last 6 months with the new administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think before the IRA, where Ben left off in kind of the policy story is, IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And
right.
In that law, the battery industry and materials processing industry got $6 billion to stand up, that industry here at home. And there was a lot of focus. There was other, provisions in IIJA, but there was a lot of focus on the funding side and the financing side of things. And then IRA comes into play a couple of years later and really was, a tax bill, as we all know. So really focused on the tax code and reforming tax to really stand up these industries that, the government deemed important for our country. To Ben's point, it was a lot more automotive focused. 30D was kind of the tax credit of discussion amongst, not just EV, automakers, but, batteries and mineral supply chain more broadly due to the content provisions and the foreign entity of concern restrictions that were put on that credit in order for automakers to be able to produce these cars that qualified for the credit. There was also the 45X credit, which was, specifically for those supply chain participants. And that in particular did not have any, content provisions or an entity of concern and restrictions on it.
And the 45X is well known for battery manufacturers, but it's basically direct subsidy per kilowatt hour of battery cells made in the U.S. and modules made in the U.S., right?
Correct. And it goes all the way up to the applicable critical minerals is what that piece of the credit is called. And that's a 10% production credit to produce those applicable critical minerals. And then there's also, kind of in between those two buckets, the electroactive materials, which, is your PCAM and, that part of the supply chain, and that's also a 10% credit. So
the what year was the IRA passed?
2022, I believe. Right then, yeah, 2022. August.
We're in 2025. If you take a step back, what do you think was accomplished by the IRA? And it's only been 2.5 years or something like that. Maybe not enough time to really see the fruits of what was set up before there's been another change. But can you kind of describe for us what has happened? Thanks.
After the IRA came implementation, and that was, basically when the government implements what Congress has passed. what how the administration wants to issue these credits, how they, comply with all these new, complex restrictions on content and, foreign entity restrictions. And that took a long time. I mean, that basically is still going on to this day from IRA. And, definitely,
Thanks.
I think, what it accomplished is, standing up, showing that that's an important part of our industrial policy, standing up these supply chains while also kind of decoupling from China and these, bringing that back to the U.S. and bringing that back to friendshoring. That's I think the message that the IRA really drove home, and that it was just about getting that right in the administration. And then that really led to where we're at today with OB cubed. I'm going to take that take forward. OB cubed. Really, how do we stand up these supply chains that we all agree are critical while doing it in a way that doesn't increase the reliance on security.
Right.
So that's the background.
Right.
Thanks.
And Ben, one of the things that was interesting to me as we got started as a company, certainly the IRA was a big part of our at least our tactical choices about where to do manufacturing. I mean, as a business person, without policy support, it's really not economically feasible to compete with a U.S. cell manufacturing capability versus what the cost structure would look like in Southeast Asia or in China. Certainly not in the beginning. Arguably, as companies get to scale, there's some real advantages to manufacturing U.S. energy costs and automation and proximity to markets, particularly around automotive and the grid space. But certainly getting started, you would probably not make an investment in a U.S. factory and accrue all the losses it would take to go compete directly against CATL or the largest, competitors from overseas. Given that the IRA was put into law and it catalyzed, I don't know what the right number is, but certainly dozens of battery factories in the United States, there's kind of a start. And the thing that struck me about the change in tone and in tactics between kind of the Biden administration and the Trump administration was really the idea of where do these tax credits, which are basically taxpayer dollars, where do they go and who do they benefit? And, it's kind of the heart of the argument today around foreign entities of concern. Ben, maybe back to you. Can you frame that up for us and kind of the difference in emphasis and priorities between IRA circa Biden and IRA circa Trump, and then where you think it's going from a market perspective, particularly on the ESS side, which is where our focus is, how that plays with the various suppliers and customers within the market, whether it's companies overseas, domestic companies, et cetera.
When you're doing industrial policy in the US and you're trying to give the incentive to US developers, it's really hard to see some of those dollars or incentives go offshore. So I think that was the framing from IRA to the B cubed or OB cubed. I really think that's just the crux of it. So instead of just targeting the automotive sector, you then expanded out to other energy credits, including 4080 and 45Y, the distribution of grid storage and solar and wind, and really it expanded to everything, nuclear and geothermal and other credits, including 45X, the production of the modules and cells. And, there were lessons learned from IRA where the Chinese were, and probably Russian entities were restructuring their businesses in joint ventures and licensing. And And so that, and then the Chinese were also moving into third countries like Morocco and Indonesia so that they could circumvent. And really, you have to throw in tariffs to this conversation as well, because it's Edward McClone on your team always says, the carrot and stick, right? You have the incentives and the tariffs playing out, but really that is the framing here is how do you make sure that it goes to companies here who are doing the work? That's who should be benefiting from it. And it's not a given that you get this credit. You have to earn it and do the work here. And really, that's where the big shift in OB cubed came into play, and where you saw a lot of emphasis, and there's going to be a ton of work with the Treasury Department and the Hill and the administration on further refining these rules around what is now called prohibited foreign entity.
Uh-huh. And this I think brings up a couple of really key questions for how to operate in this space. So the first one, and this is near and dear to our hearts, is it's all well and good to just ban everything that's coming from China, but in the battery space, that really is the center of the world in terms of supply chain, in terms of manufacturing know-how, in terms of cost down. And the U.S. is really still just getting started. I mean, it's been a couple of years since IRA. And so by just cutting everything off, you leave a fledgling industry that is not yet grown up, can't really stand on its own, arguably, and ultimately maybe reaches failure. On the other hand, if you just leave it wide open, then the U.S. industry never gets enough critical mass and enough sort of boost to become world scale and world class to be able to compete on its own. So how do you think people are thinking about striking that balance?
The tension on that was palpable during the Biden administration. Clean energy deployment versus we need a supply chain here. We can't be beholden to others, or we need to friend shore or near shore. In this administration, I think their perspective is if we can't mine here and produce the minerals and produce the tech, maybe we should be using things that we do well here, like oil and gas. I think they're a little more unapologetic about the framing. I think what we're trying to hold on to in this whole narrative with the Trump administration is the concept of the minerals need to go into something. And they have a whole narrative on derivative products. And so the debate now becomes, so how are you supporting derivative products like automotive or energy or magnets, things that go into our technologies? Are you doing it just by tariffs and trade, foreign direct investment in the United States? Are you going to bake that into incentives? So the framing is different, and I think we're right at the beginning, really, of how that's playing out during this term over the next 4 years. OB cubed sets a path for the incentive side, right? They clearly stated in that law that batteries are important and the supply chain's important. But I totally agree with you. If you don't have that demand pull, then how do companies survive? So we need to really hammer that home and ensure that there is that connective tissue between a supply chain and the where the materials are going into. I don't know, Carly, if you had anything to add to that.
I mean, I think you hit it on the head. I think it's, it was interesting seeing kind of the debate between different lawmakers on making the credit, accessible, and then, where companies were able to claim the credit, but also making it strict enough to shift those supply chains. So, in addition to the supply demand problem, it's, how are we incentivizing this? Are we incentivizing this? And how to go about that? And who is going to benefit from those incentives? So it's been fascinating to watch.
And the lines on foreign entity of concern in the IRA were like a paragraph, right?
Right.
Then you go back to OB cubed and it's 40 pages long. And that should show you the evolution in Congress and how involved and in the weeds they got and how important this is and how they're trying to get this right. Again, industrial policy is going to be messy. We're going to make mistakes, but we need to get this right in balancing our own interests and doing things here at home for the technologies that are really important to us versus what we do with friends and what we allow even adversaries to take part in. So,
I mean, from my perspective, it does seem like there's an honest effort across, kind of the political spectrum to try and get this right. And, we've seen different voices emerge. It would be great to get your perspective on kind of the story of how this happened, right? I think where we ended up is not completely unreasonable from a battery perspective, and probably quite positive for domestic, battery companies who are trying to manufacture here in the U.S. with a bit of a phasing of, shifting the broader, longer tail supply chain over time away from foreign entities of concern. But it wasn't a linear path, that's for sure. And despite ending up kind of roughly where at least we thought it would end up, there were some big twists and turns with the House language. And it's a great reminder that there is no such thing as the government or the administration or the Democratic or Republican Party. There are many, many voices within them, all of which are fighting for their ideas to ultimately become law. What the heck happened? I mean, this is the first time maybe I personally have been, more deeply involved in the sausage making of how laws get made. It's kind of probably not something that a business person or an engineer should ever, have to witness. So is this normal, or or would you say extraordinary in terms of how the policy ultimately came together and the switch in language between the House and the Senate? Tell us the story. Pull back the curtain on what happens in the halls of DC.
I mean, I don't think anything that's been happening the last few months is normal. I think everything can be categorized as extraordinary, one way or the other. But I think, from this discussion in particular, we knew early on in our work, with Congress at the House, we really wanted to get IRA. It was, the Biden, legacy climate law that, Republicans on the Hill and, President Trump were really, anti all throughout the campaign and a lot, first few months of his administration. So we knew they were going to look to gut those credits. We didn't know exactly how far they would go. They did go very far. And, the first text that we saw out of the House was an effective repeal, basically. Even the credits that we thought might be safe, including 45X, that have, historically had bipartisan support. We knew 30D was most likely gone, given that it's a credit for electric vehicles. So, we expected some, harsh language from the House. And, at the same time, we still hit the House hard. We still, lobbied for batteries. And there were a lot of champions that were trying to find a middle ground. We saw letters from, moderate Republicans. Higgins, Virginia really led a lot of that in the House. Amade, a few others in the House really, kind of realized that the House Freedom Caucus members were the loudest voices in the room, and they had to get out of the House, which they did. But, the real fight really happened in the Senate, in terms of, getting the text right and having those more technical conversations versus just, in the House, anti-IRA was just kind of an inevitability. So a lot of those discussions, happened in the Senate.
How close really was it? Because we ended up with pretty different language out of the Senate, and that's ultimately become law. I mean, from your perspective, how did that happen? And what did it require in terms of political capital, maybe from some of the moderates? And how close was it to not succeeding?
I'd like to say that it's not always high drama, but it kind of always is. And where you end up is in the Senate, ultimately, which is a more moderate body, typically. And so when we started our lobbying on this, we started 7 months before and really kicked into gear 4 months before the passage of the bill. And we focused, I mean, Carly is right. We did focus on the House because you don't ignore a chamber of Congress, and no offense to our House colleagues, but the majority of our work was on the technical writing and getting and locking down the key base in the Senate to support the battery industry, and really to build the narrative around why batteries are so important and that they're different than intermittent renewable sources. They're a baseload and dispatchable power. And so that's where we spent our time, and going back to, the base of how Venn works and how we work with our clients and how we build coalitions to work on this. We also 6-7 months ago brought 7 lobbying firms together who focus in the battery world, some think tanks, some law firms, some traditional lobbying firms, our colleagues, to say, can we get to a singular ask by the industry to Congress to make it as easy as possible for them? And what ended up transpiring is some of us ended up partnering, some of us didn't, but at least we opened the dialogue so we knew who was talking to who, and that enabled a clearer communication strategy. And you also knew where your colleagues sort of took a left turn and you took a right turn to be able to work with specific offices, because there are not that many staffers focused on energy credits in the Senate while they're also doing health credit, Medicaid, and defense funding, right? You have a subset of maybe 15 staff really hunkered down building out the OB cubed stuff. And so we wanted it to work. And that's how we did it behind the scenes. Certainly that's how Peak operates too, but you have to find your friends, you have to be clear-eyed and have clear messages. You got to get the timing of your asks down. And that is really what leads to success for the industry in the end, is that they understood where the aperture was for the industry of what was a red line, what was not going to succeed, let the industry succeed, and how, where they could push limits on certain requirements. And so that's how we operated to get things done. I mean, it does come down to the Senate and that moderating voice, where the House it's a three vote majority right now. And they're it's much more fractured in how it's set up. That's the people's house, right?
Right. So here we are now. So the bill was passed on July 4th. Fair amount of detail in the rules, particularly around FIAC and kind of supply chain rules for what qualifies for credits, et cetera. What is next in terms of implementation? Despite the detail in the law, there's lots of room for interpretation. And, this is always one of the big complaints from industry in general, is just how can we plan a business when you don't know what the rules of the road are? How can you make billion-dollar investments into factories that need to pay off over 5-10 years when there's a perceived lack of clarity and stability in the rules? Can you give us some perspective on what's coming in terms of rulemaking, et cetera, and how you see this playing out over the next few years?
Right. Yeah. And I think that was, one of the lessons learned from IRA was that the implementation process has to have some sort of guardrails around it, or else we're just going to be on this cycle indefinitely. So we saw in the bill, deadlines for guidance on much of this. There was a deadline put into text of, I think it was, the end of 2026, December 31st, 2026 is the deadline. That was included in statute. But we saw, just days after the law passed, President Trump came out with an executive order directing Treasury to move forward with guidance on certain pieces of the bill within 45 days. So that process has been ongoing. What that, executive order was focused on was primarily the wind and solar piece and, what classifies as commenced construction for those projects that have, stricter deadlines in order to claim these credits. So we're expected to see those, more clarity on at least those pieces very soon within the next couple of weeks.
Do you think that's going to be focused on just wind and solar, or how do batteries play into that debate?
I think it will be focused primarily on wind and solar because that's what the executive order directed, but we could see, more in that, based on kind of our conversations we've had, that's their focus for now. Because everything is so complicated, right? I mean, they this shouldn't be rushed, but they're going to do what they have to do, and it's a long, a lot of discussion and a lot of details that has to be, ironed out to really get this right across all technologies and
right. So related to the stability question and related to the how do you plan question is a debate that's happening right now as we record the pod, and I won't ask you to make predictions that might turn out to be wrong tomorrow, like literally tomorrow when something drops. But what's front of mind for many of our customers, and I've heard wide-ranging opinions on this from them, is what is going to happen with traditional rules around safe harbor provision for starting a construction project. And from our customer's perspective, from an industry perspective, that's perhaps a way to add some transition time and stability in the rules so that you can actually migrate your supply chains and your investments toward the new rules over time. I've heard everything from a major company that basically says, we're just never going to buy Chinese equipment ever again because it's too risky. The rules keep changing. I don't know what's going to happen. So I'm just going to build a whole strategy around ex-China. To the very opposite of that, another major firm whose point of view is there will definitely be plenty of Chinese systems in the market. People, I don't know how, but they will find a way to get around all the rules. And we expect that to be a major part of the market. And therefore, we have a multi-pronged strategy of, Chinese OEMs, non-China, non-fiat, but non-US supply chain, and then US supply chain. So they're hedging their bets, but they're not necessarily all in on the domestic side. All of them have plans to essentially start construction and safe harbor projects that certainly would get them through 2028, maybe through 2029. I think John Ketchum, CEO of NextEra, the largest renewable company in the world, also the largest gas turbine company in the United States, has stated publicly on the earnings call last week that they are safe harbored through the end of 2029. And so, how do you think about this argument that's happening around safe harbor provisions? And assuming that it remains the way it is, what does that even mean for all of these fiat rules that basically you could safe harbor around until 2030, and then the IRA starts to phase out right then anyway? So this is a big topic of debate within the industry, and I think there's wide-ranging opinions. What are your opinions, and how do you view it?
It is a big topic, and I think again, wind and solar really stricter restrictions that they have to meet in order to claim the credit. It's batteries were, due to all of, a lot of industry, advocacy, energy storage really got lumped in, with the baseload power, nuclear, geothermal, those types of technologies. So, for wind and solar, there's a, hard place in service deadline that they have to meet in order to claim the credit. And if they don't, then they're not going to get the credit. What commence construction or place in service means is another part of the conversation. And, historically for years in statute or in code, I should say, commence construction was, I think, 5% of production costs have been spent, or,
Right.
significant work has been done on your project. And that's been, that's been codified in code. President Trump is looking to make sure that wind and solar projects aren't, fudging the books, I guess you should say, to, skirt some of these requirements that come in over time. So that's another piece of the safe harbor is, these requirements are increasing over time. So like through 2029, for instance, the safe harbor language really is on the 45Y and 48E side of things, but, the percentages increase, and, it's based on commence construction or place in service, depending on which technology you are and what, there's different thresholds that you have to meet and different timelines you have to meet. So it's very, very complicated. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to, what that means for different stakeholders across the supply chain and across technologies. So a lot remains to be seen there.
And we've seen a lot of change in policy. The IRA itself was a giant change in policy. And now with the OB cubed, when do you think this starts to become settled in terms of policy that companies can invest in? Does the passage of the OB cube just mean that 6 months later we do another reconciliation and now everything gets thrown out the window, or do we think we're heading into a period of stability, at least as far as we can see, till the next big election?
Carly is right. There's nothing normal about the last 6 months. It's everything all at once, and so there has been a particular period of unknown as to how this is going to play out. I really hope we are headed there, and I kind of feel it. And we did say it would start to settle down around now. So in any administration, it takes 6 to 9 months. You start to get assistant secretary level people. These are the lowest rung of Senate confirmed appointees running massive parts of agencies. You now have the Treasury holds the Office of Tax Policy, and the Department of Treasury holds the keys to writing the rule sets, and they want to do this over the next 12 to 18 months. And so engagement with them is really important. You're also hitting deadlines on the tariff side. The president used emergency authorities to do reciprocal tariffs and is simultaneously working with his team to sign trade deals. And some of those the contours of those deals are starting to come out, and we're starting to understand the tariff levels between countries and what foreign direct investment and key technologies those trade deals are focusing on, which is it's going to take probably another 6 months on the trade front to settle down. But I do think we are starting the next phase of engagement with the Trump team, with people who've been in place since the beginning, who have set rules. You're going to see more people confirmed come September when the Senate is back in session, and you're going to see things settle out on that front. And the other thing I'll add is this has been a very friendly administration to getting projects built. I think they want to be removing barriers on permitting and working with state government and really making sure the interagency is quickly responding to industry as they move through funding or other issues. And so, some have called it transactional, but I've called it an openness to doing business in the United States in a way that, is refreshing. So I think there's all those things add up to, I think we're heading into more stability. However, there's other market forces, like what happens when you put a $5 trillion bill on the table with where the dollar sits in the global economy. What are the Chinese and other partners going to do in terms of reciprocal tariffs? Are we going to head into a recession? Like all of those things are still out there as unknowns, and we can't predict how those larger forces will react to the first 6 months, which have been extraordinary. So I'm hopeful, but I don't want to say we're settled now. We're certainly not. And I think there's going to be a really interesting next 6 months of this chapter that we're part of.
Appreciate your perspective on that. For those of us making investment decisions, hopefully the big picture trends are starting to become clear and the field goes to the bold. If this job were easy, everyone would do it. Ben and Carly, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and insight around the world of policy, particularly around battery policy, which is a never-ending, interesting topic. Appreciate it again, and thank you very much. And keep fighting the good fight on Capitol Hill. The industry appreciates it.
Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Cam. Appreciate it.
Keep up the good work in industry.
All right. Take care, guys.